They said a man without a roof over his own head had no business saving someone else's, but that night, the rain proved them wrong. The storm came down over the Maine coast with a cold, steady anger, sweeping across the dark pines and rattling the old road signs along Route 1 like loose bones in the wind. Caleb Whitaker slept lightly in the cab of his faded blue Ford pickup, parked behind a closed gas station where the security light buzzed above him and the smell of wet asphalt seeped through the cracked window. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, white, and weathered by service, grief, and too many nights spent listening to rain strike metal instead of shingles. His dark hair, touched with grey at the temples, curled beneath an old watch cap, and his jaw carried the rough stubble of a man who had learned to choose warmth over appearances. Beside him, Ranger stirred. The 6-year-old German shepherd lifted his head from the blanket on the passenger seat, amber eyes fixed on the hill beyond town. His sable coat caught the weak glow of the gas station light, black and tan shifting like shadows over muscle. Caleb knew that look. Ranger had worn it overseas, in burnt-out roads and quiet places where danger did not announce itself. The dog was hearing something the storm tried to hide. Then it came. A sharp, hollow bang rolled down from Whitcomb Hill. Not thunder. Not a branch. Metal against wood. Once. Twice. A third time, slower, like a bell struck by a trembling hand. Ranger gave 3 short barks and shoved his nose against the door handle. Caleb sat up, every old instinct in him suddenly awake. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his hand was already reaching for his boots. Through the rain-streaked windshield, far above the dark roofs of the town, one lonely estate light flickered behind a curtain of trees. Most people in Camden Falls knew that house by name, even if they had never stepped inside it. Whitcomb Estate, 32 acres on the ridge, all grey stone, weathered cedar, and windows that looked out toward the Atlantic like tired eyes. Folk said an old widow lived there alone, a woman with more land than company and more memories than visitors. Caleb had passed the gate before. He had never gone in. Men with no address learned not to walk up long driveways unless invited. But Ranger was already out, paws splashing through the flooded gravel, nose lifted toward the hill. Caleb followed with a coil of rope, a dented toolbox, and the kind of quiet urgency war had left in his bones. By the time they reached the estate, rain was pouring from the gutters in silver sheets. A strip of roofing had torn loose above the front porch, slamming hard against the chimney with every gust. Beneath it stood Eleanor Whitcomb, 84 years old, small as a candle in the storm, one hand clinging to the porch rail while the other fought a blue top that whipped and snapped above her head. Caleb called. "Step back from the edge." She turned, startled, her white hair pinned badly beneath a rain hood, her face pale but stubborn. "The library ceiling is leaking," she shouted. "Thomas's books are in there." Caleb did not know who Thomas was, and he did not ask. Some names were carried like photographs close to the heart. He only looked at the roof, then at Ranger, who stood below the stairs with his ears pinned forward, watching the sagging overhang as if counting its breaths. Caleb moved fast but gently, guiding Eleanor away from the open rain and into the shelter of the doorway. "Stay inside where it's dry," he said. "I'll secure what I can." "I can pay," she answered quickly, as if afraid kindness always came with a hidden bill. Caleb looked up at the broken roof, then back at the thin line of water already running beneath her door. "Nobody should have rain falling inside their own house," he said. And with that, he climbed. The ladder groaned under him, the wind pressed cold fingers against his soaked shirt, and the old shingles shifted beneath his boots, but his hands remembered what his heart had tried to forget. Build the brace. Find the weight. Protect the weak point. In the dark, with Ranger watching from below and Eleanor's porch light trembling behind him, Caleb Whitaker began repairing a stranger's roof before he ever knew the house was waiting to change his life. The first nail went in crooked because the wind shoved Caleb's shoulder at the wrong moment, but the second found the beam cleanly, and after that his hand settled into the old rhythm. Rain ran down his sleeves and gathered at his elbows, dripping into the dark below, yet he worked without complaint, one knee pressed against the roofline, one boot braced against the gutter he already knew would need replacing by spring. The loose sheet of flashing had peeled back near the chimney, letting water slide beneath the shingles and pour toward the east side of the house. It was not a full repair, not in weather like this, but Caleb had learned long ago that sometimes saving a thing meant giving it just enough strength to survive the night. Ranger paced below, never barking now, only watching. Every few seconds, the German shepherd lifted his nose toward the attic vents, then looked back at Caleb with those amber eyes that seemed to hold a question no man could answer. Eleanor stood just inside the front door, wrapped in an old wool shawl, her small hands folded at her chest. In the porch light, she looked less like the owner of a grand estate and more like someone left behind inside it, a fragile keeper of rooms too large for one heart. "You should come down before you catch your death," she called, her voice thin beneath the rain. Caleb tightened the last strap over the top and pressed his palm against the patched section. The roof shuddered under another gust, but this time it held. "It will keep until morning," he said. When he climbed down, his boots hit the porch boards with a tired thud, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing steam into the cold. Eleanor reached for a small purse on the hallway table. "Please," she said. "At least take something for your trouble." Caleb shook his head before she could open it. "No, I did not do much." Her eyes moved over his soaked jacket, the mud on his jeans, the cracked skin across his knuckles. Men who do not do much rarely climb roofs in November rain. A faint smile touched his face, then vanished as quickly as it came. "Ranger could use some water, if you have it." The request seemed to soften something in her. She nodded and led them into the entry hall, where the air smelled of cedar, old books, and a fire that had nearly gone out. The house was grand, but not comfortable in the way rich houses were supposed to be. Dust rested on the frames of oil paintings. A runner rug had faded from red to rust. Somewhere deeper inside, water tapped into a bucket with patient little notes. Ranger stepped in carefully, as if he understood he had entered a place full of sleeping memories. Eleanor brought a ceramic bowl from the kitchen and filled it at the sink. The dog drank slowly, then paused, ears rising. Caleb noticed at once. "What is it, boy?" Ranger turned toward the staircase, his body still except for the slight tremble in his shoulders. Above them, beyond the carved banister and the shadowed landing, something clicked. Not loud. Not threatening. Just a soft metallic shift, like an old latch remembering it had once been opened. Eleanor froze with the bowl still in her hands. Caleb looked toward her. The color had drained from her face. "The attic?" he asked gently. She did not answer at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stairs, but they seemed to be seeing another year, another storm, another man standing where Caleb stood now. At last she whispered, "The north side of the attic has been sealed for 22 years. Ranger took one step forward and placed a paw on the first stair. Then another sound came from above, a slow drip followed by a hollow knock beneath the boards. Caleb felt the house go quiet around them, as if every wall had stopped breathing to listen. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the empty bowl. "My husband said that room should stay closed until the right person heard it call," she said. Caleb had repaired many roofs in his life, but as he looked up into the dark stairwell with Ranger waiting below the first landing, he understood this was no longer about rain. Caleb stood at the foot of the staircase, listening to the rain soften against the roof he had just patched, while Ranger kept one paw on the first step as if holding open an invisible door. The hallway around them seemed to narrow in the lamplight, its faded wallpaper blooming with shadows from the fire in the front. "Room." Eleanor set the empty bowl on a small table, and the ceramic touched the wood with a sound so delicate it made the silence feel even older. "Thomas was my husband," she said, not looking at Caleb. "He built half of this place with his own hands after the shipyard closed. Folks remember the money, but I remember the sawdust in his hair and the way he smelled like pine tar when he came home before supper." Caleb did not move. He had learned that some memories needed room to walk out on their own. Eleanor lifted her eyes toward the staircase. The north attic was his last project. He worked up there for months after the doctors told him to slow down. He said every house should have one secret room, not for hiding shame, but for keeping promises safe. Ranger's ears twitched. Another soft knock came from above, slower this time, followed by the faint tick of dripping water finding metal. Caleb glanced toward the ceiling. If water is getting in, whatever is up there may not stay protected much longer. Eleanor pressed her fingers together, the knuckles pale and thin. I know. Her voice trembled, but not from fear alone. I think I have known for years. She led him to a narrow closet beneath the stairs and took down a brass key from a hook hidden behind an old winter coat. The key was dark with age, its teeth worn smooth, tied with a strip of blue ribbon that had faded almost grey. For a moment she held it in her palm as if it weighed more than metal. He told me not to open it for greed, not for grief, and not for family pressure. Only when the house itself asked. Caleb looked at her gently. And you believe it is asking tonight? Eleanor turned toward Ranger. The German shepherd had not taken his eyes off the landing. I believe your dog heard it before I had the courage to. The staircase creaked beneath Caleb's boots as he climbed, toolbox in one hand, lantern in the other. Eleanor followed slowly, one hand along the rail, with Ranger staying close to her side as if he had appointed himself guardian of every fragile step. At the top, the air grew colder. The landing window rattled softly in its frame, and beyond the glass the black silhouettes of spruce trees bent under the storm. The north attic door stood at the end of the hall, half hidden behind a tall wardrobe draped in a white sheet. Caleb moved the wardrobe carefully, its wooden feet groaning across the floorboards. Behind it appeared a narrow door with no handle, only a brass plate set into the wood. Eleanor placed the key against it, but her hand hesitated. Caleb said nothing. He only lifted the lantern higher so the light would be there when she needed it. At last the key turned. The lock gave a tired click, and a breath of cold air slipped out through the seam, carrying the scent of dust, cedar, and something metallic beneath the rain. Ranger stepped forward first, nose low, shoulders tense. Caleb pushed the door open. The lantern light entered slowly, revealing rafters, old trunks, rolled blueprints, and a long work table beneath a slanted window. Water dripped from a corner of the patched roof into a tin basin that must have been placed there decades ago. Beside it sat a small armor-green box, untouched by dust, as if someone had been waiting for the right storm to point it out. Eleanor covered her mouth with one hand. On the lid, written in Thomas Whitcomb's careful hand, were 5 words that made Caleb's chest tighten: for the man who stops. Caleb did not touch the box right away. Something about the words on the lid made the little attic feel larger than it was, as if the whole estate had leaned closer to hear what he would do next. Rain tapped the slanted window in soft, uneven strokes, and the tin basin caught each drop from the roof with a patient ping that sounded almost like a clock. Eleanor stood beside the work table, her shawl gathered tight around her shoulders, her eyes wet but steady. For the man who stops, she whispered. Thomas used to say that was the rarest kind of man. Not the one who runs fastest. Not the one who speaks loudest. The one who sees trouble and stops. Caleb looked down at his hands. They were rough, red from the cold, still trembling slightly from the climb and the storm. He thought of all the roads he had kept driving because stopping hurt too much, all the towns where he had bought coffee with coins from the ashtray and left before anyone could ask his name. He had not come to Whitcomb Estate looking for meaning. He had followed a dog through the rain because an old roof was crying in the dark. Ranger moved closer to the work table, sniffed the edge of the armor-green box, then sat down calmly, his tail resting still against the dusty floor. That was what convinced Caleb more than anything. Ranger never relaxed near danger. Caleb opened the latch. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth, a brass key smaller than the first, several folded blueprints, and a photograph worn soft at the corners. Eleanor reached for the photograph first. In it, a younger Thomas Whitcomb stood on the front porch of the estate beside a row of men in work jackets, some smiling, some shy, one holding a German shepherd puppy against his chest. Behind them, the roof was new, bright cedar shingles shining in the sun. Eleanor pressed the picture to her heart. He never showed me this one. Caleb unfolded the top sheet of paper. It was not a letter, but a drawing of the estate, every room marked in Thomas's precise hand. The north wing had been circled in blue. Beneath it, a narrow line led to a notation Caleb read twice before speaking. There is a service corridor behind the library wall. Eleanor turned slowly. Behind the library? He nodded. Looks like it connects to an old records room. Maybe from when the house still had staff. At the word library, Eleanor's face changed. That was where the water had been falling. That was where Thomas's books were kept. That was where the roof had first called for help. Ranger stood, ears lifting again, and walked to the far wall of the attic, where rolled insulation had sagged between two beams. He gave one soft whine, then pressed his nose to a loose floorboard beneath the wall. Caleb crouched beside him and ran his fingers along the seam. The board shifted. Not much, only a fraction of an inch, but enough for an old builder to notice. With careful pressure from his pocketknife, Caleb lifted the edge. Beneath it was not empty space, but a thin brass plate with another line engraved into it, "Protect the books, and you will find the door." Eleanor sat down hard on an old wooden chair, not from weakness, but from the weight of recognition. Thomas always said books remember what people forget. Caleb replaced the board gently and looked toward the attic door. Below them, the house groaned softly in the wind, old but standing, wounded but not defeated. He understood now that the roof had not simply been leaking. It had been pointing. Every drop, every knock, every sound Ranger heard had been leading them toward something Thomas had hidden where only care would uncover it. Eleanor looked at Caleb with a strange mixture of fear and hope. "Would you look at the library with me?" she asked. Caleb closed the box, gathered the blueprints, and lifted the lantern. "Yes," he said. "But we go slow." Ranger stepped ahead of them into the hallway, nose already turned toward the stairs, as if the dog knew the next secret was waiting below. The library waited at the end of the east hall, behind a pair of pocket doors that had not slid smoothly in years. Caleb set his shoulder gently against the warped wood and eased it open inch by inch, careful not to force anything that age had made fragile. The smell came first: old paper, damp plaster, cold ashes from a fireplace long unused, and beneath it all the faint sweetness of cedar oil Eleanor must have rubbed into the shelves when her hands were steadier. Ranger entered before them, slow and deliberate, his nails clicking against the dark floorboards. The room was larger than Caleb expected, 2 stories high, with a narrow balcony circling the upper shelves and tall windows looking out toward the black shape of the Atlantic beyond the trees. Rain streaked the glass in silver lines. Near the far wall, a bucket sat beneath a steady drip from the ceiling, each drop landing with a small hollow note. Eleanor looked at it as if it were an accusation. "I tried to move the books myself last week," she said softly. "I got through one shelf before my knees reminded me I am 84, not 40. Caleb glanced at her, and for the first time that night she almost smiled. He carried the bucket aside, then climbed the short rolling ladder to check the upper wall. Water had slipped behind the plaster near a built-in bookcase, staining the wallpaper in the shape of a dark wing. "It has been leaking longer than tonight," he said, not unkindly. Eleanor nodded. "I know. I kept telling myself I would call someone." Her voice thinned. "Then I would remember I did not know who to call." Caleb said nothing. Loneliness had a way of making even a telephone feel heavy. He began pulling books from the endangered shelf, stacking them carefully on a dry table. They were not the kind of books rich people bought for decoration. They were worn atlases, shipbuilding manuals, weather journals, hymnals with frayed ribbons, and old ledgers from the Whitcomb yard. Ranger watched from near the fireplace, nose lifted, ears turning toward sounds inside the wall. Caleb reached the back of the middle shelf and paused. One row of books would not move. He tugged gently again. The spine shifted together as one solid panel. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said. Eleanor came closer, one hand on the table for balance. Caleb pressed along the edges until his thumb found a small brass notch hidden behind a volume of Maine coastal charts. The moment he touched it, Ranger gave one quiet bark. Caleb pulled. Somewhere inside the wall, a mechanism answered with a tired click. The entire shelf moved outward less than an inch, breathing dust into the lantern light. Eleanor covered her mouth. Thomas, she whispered, and the name was not a question but a prayer. Caleb took the smaller brass key from the armor green box and studied the lock now visible behind the shelf. It fit perfectly. When he turned it, the wood released with a low sigh, opening onto a narrow corridor lined with cedar planks. Cool air drifted out, clean and dry, untouched by the leak. On the floor lay a canvas runner, and along the walls hung framed photographs of men and women standing beside old trucks, work benches, fishing boats, and kitchen tables. Each picture had a name beneath it, and beside many names were 2 words written in Thomas Whitcomb's careful hand: needed shelter. Eleanor stepped into the passage as if entering a chapel. Caleb lifted the lantern higher. At the end of the corridor stood a steel cabinet, painted blue, with a folded letter taped to its front. Ranger padded straight to it and sat down, calm as dawn. Caleb removed the letter and handed it to Eleanor, but her hands trembled too much to unfold it. "Please," she said. So Caleb opened it and read the first line aloud. "If this door has opened, then someone kind has finally protected the house before trying to possess it." The words seemed to rest in the hidden corridor long after Caleb spoke them, as if Thomas Whitcomb had been waiting 22 years for a stranger's voice to bring them back into the air. Eleanor stood beside the blue cabinet with one hand pressed lightly against the cedar wall, her face lifted toward the letter but her eyes filled with memories no room could fully hold. Caleb continued reading, quietly, because loudness felt wrong in a place built for promises. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the house has survived another storm, and someone with patient hands has helped it do so. I have hidden these records not because I mistrusted you, but because I knew grief would bring wolves to the porch, dressed as family, advisors, and friends." Caleb paused, uncomfortable with the intimacy of another man's farewell, but Eleanor nodded for him to continue. Ranger sat still at his feet, ears high, watching the cabinet as if it were breathing. Caleb read on. "This estate was never meant to become a prize. It was meant to become a shelter. During the hardest years at the shipyard, when men came home from service with no work, when widows lost farms to taxes, when old sailors slept in trucks along the coast, we opened the carriage house quietly. You made soup. I fixed stoves. Nobody signed papers. Nobody rang bells. We simply made room." Eleanor closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down one cheek. "I remember," she whispered. "I thought those were just hard winters." Caleb looked at the photographs lining the corridor again. The faces seemed different now, no longer decorations, but witnesses. Thomas had not hidden wealth behind the library. He had hidden evidence of mercy. The letter trembled slightly in Caleb's hand as he reached the next lines. "If I am gone before I can finish the legal work, the documents in this cabinet will explain everything. The land trust, the maintenance accounts, the old veterans' dormitory plans, the shoreline easement, and the deed restrictions I drafted to protect this place from being sold in pieces. But the house must choose its caretaker through you, Eleanor. Not the richest. Not the closest blood. The one who protects before asking what can be gained." A gust of wind moved through the walls, and somewhere behind them the pocket door gave a soft wooden creak. Caleb lowered the letter. "Mrs. Whitcomb, this is more than a family note." Eleanor opened her eyes. "It is a map of his heart." Caleb reached for the cabinet handle, then stopped. "Do you want me to open it?" She looked at him carefully, taking in the soaked cuffs of his shirt, the toolbox near his boot, the rainwater still dripping from his hair onto her polished floor. "Yes," she said. "I think Thomas already did." The cabinet opened with a low rasp. Inside were labeled folders, rolled architectural drawings, bank envelopes, and a leather-bound ledger tied with twine. Caleb lifted the top folder and saw names printed across the first page: Whitcomb Haven Restoration Plan. Beneath it was a sketch of the estate transformed, the carriage house divided into warm rooms, the old greenhouse rebuilt into a community kitchen, the north pasture marked for service dog training, and the library labeled simply, Quiet Room for Those Who Cannot Sleep. Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. For a moment, he was no longer in a hidden corridor in Maine. He was in his own truck, parked behind grocery stores, listening to Ranger breathe in the passenger seat while the world on the other side of the glass had beds, lamps, coffee makers, and locks on doors. He swallowed hard and looked away. Eleanor saw it, though she was kind enough not to name it. "You know what this place was meant for," she said. Caleb closed the folder slowly. "I know what it feels like to need a place and not have one." Before Eleanor could answer, Ranger rose suddenly, turning back toward the library. His body did not stiffen with fear, but with warning. Caleb followed his gaze. Through the narrow opening, headlights swept across the rain-streaked windows, bright and sharp against the dark. A car had come up the long driveway. Then another. Eleanor's expression changed, the softness leaving her face like a curtain drawn against cold. "My nephew Martin," she said. A second pair of headlights stopped behind the first. "And my niece Claire." Caleb set the folder back into the cabinet and closed it gently. Downstairs, a car door slammed in the rain, followed by impatient knocking at the front entrance. Ranger stepped between Eleanor and the library doors without being told. Caleb picked up his toolbox, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of why he had come. The storm had brought more than water to Whitcomb Estate that night. It had brought the past, the truth, and now the people who wanted both kept quiet. The knocking came again, sharper this time, echoing through the estate like a hand striking an old memory. Eleanor straightened in the library doorway, small beneath the tall shelves but no longer looking fragile. Caleb noticed the change. The same woman who had trembled before an attic door now held herself with quiet authority, as if Thomas's letter had placed a lantern back inside her chest. Ranger stayed close to her left side, his amber eyes fixed down the hall. Caleb closed the hidden pocket door behind the bookshelf until only the faintest seam remained, then carried the lantern toward the front of the house. The entry hall had cooled while they were upstairs. Rainwater rattled against the windows, and the patched roof gave a low, steady groan, but it held. Eleanor reached the door before Caleb could offer to open it for her. When she turned the knob, a gust pushed in, carrying the smell of wet wool, expensive perfume, and cold impatience. Martin Whitcomb stood on the porch in a dark overcoat, his silver hair combed neatly despite the storm, his mouth set in a line that looked practiced in mirrors. Beside him, Claire Whitcomb held a black umbrella low over her blonde hair, her eyes moving past Eleanor at once, taking inventory of the hallway, the rugs, the paintings, and finally Caleb's soaked clothes. "Aunt Eleanor, Martin," said, too loudly, as if speaking to someone already half gone. "We saw a truck below the hill. Are you all right?" Eleanor looked from him to Claire. "I am wet, tired, and perfectly able to answer my own door." Claire's gaze settled on Caleb's toolbox. "Who is this?" Caleb stepped back, giving Eleanor the dignity of answering first. "This is Caleb Whittaker," she said. "He repaired my roof tonight." Martin's eyes narrowed. "In this weather?" "Because of this weather," Eleanor replied. Claire gave a small laugh without warmth. "A stranger just happened to come up here in the middle of a storm and climb onto your roof." Ranger made a quiet sound deep in his chest. Not a threat, only a boundary. Caleb rested one hand lightly on the dog's collar. Ranger heard the flashing come loose, he said. "I followed him." Martin glanced at the German shepherd and then at Caleb as if both belonged outside. "That is convenient." Eleanor's voice sharpened, not much, but enough to make the hall still. "What is convenient, Martin, is family arriving after the roof is fixed." The words landed softly, yet they changed the air. Claire lowered her umbrella. "We came because we are concerned. You are alone in this enormous place. We have talked about this. A safer facility near Portland would make sense, and the estate could finally be handled properly." Caleb saw Eleanor's fingers tighten around the doorknob. He knew that phrase, handled properly. People used words like that when they meant sold, emptied, divided, erased. Martin stepped inside without being invited, brushing rain from his coat. "We should not discuss this in front of hired help." "He is not hired help," Eleanor said. "He refused payment." Claire's expression flickered. That is worse. Caleb felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his eyes low. He had survived enough judgment to know that answering every insult only gave it a chair to sit in. He moved toward the hallway table and picked up his cap. Mrs. Whitcomb, your main leak is stopped for tonight. I can come back in daylight if you need a proper repair. Ranger turned to him sharply, ears lifting, as if the dog could not believe what he was hearing. Eleanor looked at Caleb, and for the first time that night, fear returned to her eyes. Not fear of Martin or Claire, but fear of being left alone with people who saw her home as paperwork. Caleb recognized that look too. It was the look of someone standing in a room full of relatives and still having no one. Before he could speak, a sound came from the library behind them. A soft wooden click. Then another. Martin turned. What was that? Claire's eyes narrowed toward the east hall. Ranger stepped forward before anyone else moved, placing himself between the Whitcombs and the library doors. Caleb slowly set his cap back down. The house, old and wounded but faithful, had spoken again. And this time, everyone had heard it. For one long second, no one moved. The sound from the library faded into the rain, but its echo seemed to remain in the walls, waiting to see which heart would answer honestly. Martin's face tightened with suspicion. Claire's eyes sharpened in a way that made Caleb think of a person hearing coins drop in another room. Eleanor stepped forward, small but steady, and lifted one hand before either of them could pass her. No, she said. Martin blinked. No. You will not walk through my house as if I am already gone. The words were calm, but they carried more strength than shouting ever could. Caleb kept his place near the hallway table, though every instinct told him to stand between Eleanor and her relatives. He did not want to make this his battle. He had only come because a roof was failing. Yet Ranger remained planted before the library doors, shoulders squared, ears high, guarding not a treasure but a truth. Claire folded her umbrella with slow, deliberate movements. Aunt Eleanor, listen to yourself. Strange noises, sealed rooms, a homeless man and a dog in your hallway at midnight. This is exactly why we are worried. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward Caleb. He has a name. Claire's mouth pressed thin. And an address? The question struck the hall with a colder sound than the storm outside. Caleb looked down at his boots, still muddy from the hill road. There were insults a man could answer, and there were truths he had to carry in silence. Because they were too tired to defend themselves. Before Eleanor could speak, Ranger gave one quiet bark, not loud, not angry, but final. The library doors trembled again behind him. This time, the pocket shelf inside must have shifted from the draft, because a line of warm cedar-scented air slipped into the hall. Martin noticed it. What have you opened? Eleanor's face changed, and Caleb saw the decision settle over her like a shawl. She walked past Ranger into the library, and after a moment, she said, "Come in, then. All of you. Since the house has chosen tonight to stop keeping secrets." Caleb followed last, lantern in hand. The library looked different with Martin and Claire inside it. Their polished shoes, their rain-dark coats, their quick hungry glances seemed out of place among the old ledgers, hymnals, and weather journals. Ranger led them to the bookcase, then sat beside the loosened panel. Eleanor touched the brass notch, and the hidden shelf opened with its soft, breath-like sigh. Claire took one step back. Martin stared as the narrow cedar corridor appeared behind the books. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Your uncle was very good at making room where others saw only walls," Eleanor said. She entered first, not waiting for approval. Caleb held the lantern high as the photographs along the corridor came into view, each face lit briefly in gold. Men in work jackets. Widows beside soup pots. Veterans standing beside old trucks. Children bundled in donated coats. Names written carefully beneath them, year after year, mercy after mercy. Claire's expression faltered, not with tenderness, but confusion. Martin moved toward the blue cabinet at the end of the corridor. "What is in there?" Caleb stepped aside, letting Eleanor answer. My husband's unfinished promise. She opened the cabinet and removed the folder labeled Whitcomb Haven Restoration Plan. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. Thomas did not want this estate sold for waterfront development. He wanted it protected. Martin gave a short laugh. Protected from what? Eleanor looked at him then, and the old grief in her eyes had become something brighter, something almost fierce. From people who can stand under a repaired roof and still ask only what the house is worth. The corridor went silent. Even the rain seemed to pause at the windows beyond the wall. Caleb saw Martin's face harden, saw Claire's fingers curl around the strap of her purse, saw Eleanor hold the folder against her chest as if it were not paper but a living ember. Then Ranger lowered his nose to the base of the blue cabinet and scratched once at the floor. Caleb crouched. Beneath the cabinet, half hidden in dust, was a narrow envelope sealed with dark red wax. On its front, in Thomas Whitcomb's handwriting, were the words, "To be opened when greed enters the house." The envelope lay in Caleb's hand like something too small to hold so much judgment. The dark red wax seal had cracked around the edges with age, but the imprint remained clear, a pine tree above a lantern, the old Whitcomb mark. Eleanor stared at it without breathing, while Martin and Claire stood behind her in the narrow cedar corridor, their faces caught between disbelief and calculation. Ranger sat beside Caleb, calm now, as if his work for the moment was done. "Aunt Eleanor," Martin said carefully, "we should have an attorney present before opening anything related to estate matters." Eleanor did not turn around. "You were ready to sell my home without asking the house what it remembered." Claire's voice sharpened. "That is not fair. We have been managing practical realities for years." Caleb kept his eyes on the envelope, feeling the thin paper soften slightly from the warmth of his damp fingers. Practical realities. He had heard words like that at hospital desks, bank counters, county offices, places where people spoke gently while closing doors. Eleanor reached for the envelope, then stopped when her hands trembled. "Caleb," she said softly, "would you read it?" Martin stepped forward. "Absolutely not." Ranger rose before Martin came any closer, not growling, not lunging, only standing. The German Shepherd did not need to threaten anyone. His stillness was enough. Martin stopped. Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Only if you are sure." She nodded. "Thomas left it for this moment. I will not let fear keep it sealed. A day longer." Caleb broke the wax with careful pressure. Inside was one folded sheet and a second document printed on heavy paper, yellowed but preserved. He opened the letter first. The handwriting was Thomas Whitcomb's, steady and deliberate, the kind of handwriting made by a man who believed words should carry their own weight. Caleb read in a low voice. "My beloved Eleanor, if this envelope has been found, then the house has brought the truth to a difficult room. I know there may come a day when those nearest in blood stand farthest from mercy. Do not hate them for it. Some people mistake inheritance for ownership, and ownership for love." Eleanor closed her eyes. Claire looked away toward the photographs on the wall. Caleb continued. "This estate was bought with labor, loss, and grace. It was preserved by your kindness more than my money. If our family wishes to honor us, let them serve the purpose of this place. If they wish only to divide it, then let the attached covenant speak where my voice cannot." Caleb unfolded the second document. Legal language covered the page, dense but clear enough for the important words to rise from it. Whitcomb Estate Protective Covenant. Permanent charitable use. Shelter and rehabilitation. Veterans in hardship. Elderly residents without family support. Retired service animals. Sale prohibited except by court order proving abandonment of mission. Caleb felt the corridor tilt quietly inside him. This was not a wish hidden in old paper. It was a lock placed around the future. Martin's face had gone pale with anger he was trying to disguise as concern. That document is decades old. It may not even be valid. Eleanor looked at him then, her eyes bright beneath the fragile silver of her hair. "Then we will ask Mr. Harlan in the morning." At the name, Martin's composure cracked. Harlan is still alive. Retired, Eleanor said. Not buried. Claire's voice dropped. Aunt Eleanor, you cannot possibly intend to turn 32 acres of coastal property into some kind of boarding house. The word boarding house seemed to chill the corridor. Caleb folded the letter with slow care, but inside him something old stirred, not pride, not anger, something quieter and stronger. He thought of men who slept upright in cars because lying down made memories louder. He thought of old women in towns like this one, making soup for no one because all the chairs at their tables had gone empty. He thought of Ranger, once trained to find danger, now finding doors. Eleanor took the covenant from Caleb and held it against her chest. No, she said. Not a boarding house. A haven. For the first time all night, the rain outside began to ease. The drops on the hidden corridor wall softened to a whisper. Ranger turned his head toward the library, then toward the front of the house, listening. Far below, the old grandfather clock in the entry hall struck midnight, each note traveling through the estate like a slow blessing. Eleanor looked at Caleb, and in her tired face he saw not a widow losing a home, but a guardian finally remembering the gate in her hands. Will you come back tomorrow, she asked, and help me finish the roof properly? Caleb glanced toward Martin and Claire, then down at Ranger, whose tail moved once against the floor. Yes, he said. If you still want me here. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. I think the house already does. Morning came to Whitcomb Estate not with sunlight, but with a pale grey quiet that made every wet branch shine like glass. The storm had moved out over the Atlantic before dawn, leaving the hill road washed clean and the old house wrapped in mist. Caleb had not slept much. He had spent the last few hours in his truck with Ranger curled beside him, watching the estate windows glow one by one as Eleanor moved through rooms that no longer felt entirely asleep. She had offered him the guest room twice, and twice he had thanked her and declined. Pride was part of it, but not all. A man who had lived too long without a door of his own sometimes needed time before stepping through one that opened kindly. By 7 o'clock, he was back on the roof with dry gloves Eleanor had found in Thomas's old workroom, a thermos of coffee resting near the chimney, and Ranger stationed in the yard below like a foreman with fur. The damage looked different in daylight. The roof was not failing from one storm, but from years of small neglect. A missing nail here. A cracked shingle there. A gutter bent just enough to send water where it should never go. Caleb worked slowly, replacing split cedar, resealing the flashing, and clearing leaves from the valley where two roof lines met. Each repair felt less like construction and more like apology. Below, Eleanor stood on the porch wrapped in a navy coat, watching him with Thomas's blueprints tucked under one arm. He used to whistle when he worked, she called up. Caleb glanced down. I was never much of a whistler. No, she said, almost smiling. But you listen the same way. Around mid-morning, a black sedan climbed the drive, followed by a county sheriff's cruiser and Martin's grey sport utility vehicle. Caleb paused with a hammer in hand as the doors opened. Martin stepped out first, polished and tense. Claire followed, carrying a folder against her chest. Beside them was an older man in a brown wool coat, walking with a cane but with eyes sharp enough to cut through fog. Eleanor straightened at once. Mr. Harlan, she said from the porch. You came. The old attorney removed his hat. For Thomas Whitcomb, I would come in a snowstorm. For you, Eleanor, I would come in too. The sheriff stayed near the cruiser, calm and respectful, clearly there not for trouble but to witness whatever the morning required. Caleb climbed down, wiping rain grit from his hands. Martin looked at him with open irritation. This matter does not involve the handyman. Ranger rose from the grass, and Mr. Harlan's gaze moved to the dog, then to Caleb's worn jacket, then to the repaired roof above. On the contrary, the attorney said, I suspect it may involve him more than anyone understands. Inside the library, the hidden corridor was opened again. In daylight, it seemed less haunted and more holy, a narrow chapel of cedar, photographs, an unfinished mercy. Mr. Harlan read the covenant slowly, adjusting his glasses, his face giving away little until he reached the final page. Then he exhaled through his nose, a sound somewhere between sorrow and admiration. Thomas filed the original with the county in 1998, he said. I prepared it myself. I wondered when this would surface. Martin's voice tightened. Surface? You mean you knew about this? I knew Thomas intended to protect the estate. I did not know where he placed Eleanor's copy. Claire stepped forward. But Aunt Eleanor still owns the property. She can amend her will. Mr. Harlan looked at Eleanor gently. She can. Within the restrictions of the covenant. The estate cannot be sold for private development. Not legally. Not easily. Not without betraying the stated charitable purpose Thomas recorded. The word settled over Martin and Claire like coal dust. Eleanor stood beside the blue cabinet, one hand resting on the folder marked Whitcomb Haven Restoration Plan. For the first time since Caleb had met her, she did not look like a woman trapped inside a house too large for her. She looked like its keeper. Then I want to finish what Thomas began, she said. Today. Mr. Harlan nodded. Then we will draw the papers. Martin stared at her. You cannot mean that. Eleanor turned to him, and her voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. Last night, this man climbed onto my roof in freezing rain and asked for nothing but water for his dog. You came after the roof was fixed and asked what could be controlled. That is the difference Thomas was waiting for. Caleb felt his throat tighten, but he said nothing. Outside, a thin break opened in the clouds, and pale light touched the repaired shingles above the library. Ranger walked to Eleanor and leaned gently against her leg. She lowered one hand to his head as Mr. Harlan opened his leather briefcase on Thomas's old table. Somewhere in the walls, the estate gave a soft wooden creak, not like a warning this time, but like a house finally letting out a breath it had held for 22 years. Mr. Harlan's fountain pen moved slowly across the first page, the scratching sound small but solemn in the hidden corridor. Caleb stood near the library doorway with Ranger beside him, feeling more out of place than he had on the roof in the storm. Papers had always made him uneasy. A man could measure a beam with his hands, test a shingle with his weight, listen to pipes and know where the trouble lived, but paper belonged to another world, a world of names, signatures, ownership, and doors that opened only for people who already had keys. Eleanor sat at Thomas's old work table beneath the warm pool of the desk lamp, her silver hair pinned neatly now, her navy coat folded across the chair beside her. She looked tired, but not weak. The tiredness seemed clean somehow, like the quiet after a long road finally reaches home. Mr. Harlan read each section aloud in careful language, making sure every word had a witness. The Whitcomb estate would remain protected under Thomas's covenant. The land could not be divided for private sale. The carriage house would be restored into temporary rooms for veterans in hardship. The greenhouse would become a kitchen and pantry. The north pasture would be reserved for retired service dogs and training work. The library would remain open as a quiet room for those who needed warmth, silence, or simply a chair by a window. Then Mr. Harlan reached the final section and paused. Martin, standing stiffly near the cedar wall, lifted his chin. Claire stopped tapping her fingers against her folder. Eleanor looked across the room at Caleb. Read it, she said. Mr. Harlan adjusted his glasses. Primary caretaker and legal steward of Whitcomb Haven, upon Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb's passing, shall be Caleb James Whittaker, provided he accepts the responsibilities described herein, with full residential rights for himself and his German shepherd, Ranger. Caleb felt the words strike him softly, then deeply, like rain finding earth after a drought. He said, his voice rough. You cannot mean that. Eleanor's eyes did not waver. I mean every word. You met me last night. No, she said. I met you last night. But the house met you when you stopped in the rain. Ranger met the truth before any of us had courage to open it. And Thomas described you before your boots ever touched my porch. Martin let out a controlled breath. This is reckless. Mr. Harlan looked at him over the rim of his glasses. It is legal. Claire's face had grown pale with a hurt she seemed unwilling to call. Greed. Aunt Eleanor, family should come first. Eleanor reached for the old photograph of Thomas and the men on the porch, then turned it so Claire could see the faces. Family did come first. For years. And when this house needed hands, when the roof was leaking, when I could not carry one more memory alone, family came after the stranger had already climbed the ladder. No one answered. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and a silver blade of morning light crossed the library floor. Caleb stared at the papers, seeing not an estate, not money, not status, but work. Roofs to mend. Rooms to warm. Men and women arriving with their lives folded into grocery bags. Dogs sleeping beside beds that did not move. A place where no one would have to apologize for needing shelter. The thought frightened him more than homelessness ever had, because it sounded dangerously close to hope. I do not know how to run a place like this, he said quietly. Eleanor smiled then, and for a moment the years seemed to loosen around her face. Neither did Thomas. We learned by opening the door. Ranger leaned against Caleb's knee, warm and steady, as if giving his answer first. Caleb lowered one hand to the dog's head and felt the old scar beneath the fur near his ear. They had survived by moving. Maybe now they were being asked to survive by staying. Mr. Harlan turned the page and placed the pen before him. Acceptance is not required today, he said. Caleb looked at Eleanor, at the hidden photographs, at the repaired ceiling above the library where no new water fell. Then he picked up the pen. His signature was not elegant. It was careful, uneven, and real. When he finished, Eleanor closed her eyes as if a burden had finally been set down on a table strong enough to hold it. Somewhere beyond the walls, the last drops of rain slid from the new patch of roof and fell harmlessly into the grass. For the next few weeks, Wickham Estate changed in ways so quiet that the town almost missed the miracle happening on the hill. Caleb repaired the roof properly first, not with a temporary top or a hurried patch, but with new cedar shingles, sealed flashing, straight gutters, and the patience of a man who had finally been given permission to care for something without leaving before morning. Ranger followed him from ladder to porch to carriage house, always watching, always listening, his amber eyes bright against the crisp Maine air. Eleanor moved more slowly as the days grew colder, but she seemed lighter, as if every opened room had returned one breath to her. She and Caleb spent afternoons at Thomas's table, sorting folders, reading old names, tracing the shape of Whitcomb Haven from blueprint to reality. The carriage house still smelled of dust and salt wind, but Caleb saw what it could become: 6 warm rooms with simple beds, a laundry corner, a coffee station, hooks for coats by the door, and wide spaces where tired dogs could lie without being stepped over. The greenhouse had broken glass and a door that stuck in the frame, but Eleanor called it the future kitchen, and somehow the words made Caleb believe her. Martin and Claire did not come back after Mr. Harlan filed the updated papers, though letters arrived twice, polite on the surface and cold underneath. Eleanor placed them unopened in a drawer. Some doors close themselves, she told Caleb. Do not waste good hinges chasing them. By Thanksgiving week, the first snow dusted the north pasture. Caleb had finished reinforcing the library ceiling, and not a single drop of water had touched Thomas's book since the night of the storm. Eleanor stood beneath the repaired section one afternoon, looking up with her hands folded. He would have liked you, she said. Caleb, balanced halfway down the ladder, gave a small shrug. He might have told me I missed a nail. Eleanor laughed softly, and the sound filled the library like a match struck in winter. That evening, she asked to sit on the front porch even though the air was cold enough to silver the edges of the grass. Caleb wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, brought her tea, and sat a few feet away while Ranger rested his head on her slipper. The estate lights glowed behind them. Down the hill, Camden Falls blinked through the trees, small and golden against the darkening coast. I was angry with God for a long time, Eleanor said suddenly. Caleb did not answer because he knew the tone of a heart opening a door it had kept locked. When Thomas died, I thought heaven had taken the only person who knew the real purpose of this house. I kept the rooms shut. I let dust cover the plans. I told myself I was protecting his memory, but truly, I was hiding from it." She looked at Ranger, smoothing the fur between his ears. "Then this dog heard what I refused to hear." Caleb watched his breath fade into the evening. "He has a way of doing that." Eleanor smiled. "And you stopped?" The word settled between them gently. Not praise. Not debt. Recognition. A week later, on a clear morning after the first hard frost, Caleb found Eleanor in the library chair beside the tall window, Thomas's photograph in her lap and a blue folder resting on the table beside her. She was not frightened. She was not alone. Ranger sat at her feet, calm and still, his head lifted toward the pale light coming through the glass. Caleb knew before he crossed the room that something sacred had passed quietly through the house. Eleanor's face held the softness of a person who had finally handed over the key. On the folder, in her careful handwriting, she had written Caleb's first task: open the west rooms before Christmas. He stood there for a long time, one hand on Ranger's back, listening to the old estate breathe around him. Outside, the repaired roof shone under a thin layer of frost, holding firm beneath the morning sky. By noon, the news had moved through Camden Falls with the quiet speed of church bells and winter smoke. Eleanor Whitcomb had passed in peace, and the old estate on the hill had not gone to developers, relatives, or auction signs. It had gone to a man most of the town had seen sleeping in a Ford pickup behind the gas station, and to a German shepherd who seemed to understand the house better than anyone. Mr. Harlan gathered the witnesses in the library 3 days later, where the repaired ceiling held firm above Thomas's books and pale December light rested across the floorboards. Martin and Claire came in dark coats, silent and stiff, but they did not argue when the final documents were read. The covenant was clear. Eleanor's will was clear. Whitcomb Estate, all 32 acres, every room, every pasture, every weathered-out building, was placed under Caleb Whittaker's stewardship for the purpose Thomas and Eleanor had protected across a lifetime. Caleb stood near the fireplace with Ranger at his side, his hands folded in front of him as if he were back before a commanding officer, though no rank had ever frightened him as much as this kindness did. When Mr. Harlan finished reading, he handed Caleb a small brass key tied with a blue ribbon. "Mrs. Whitcomb asked that you receive this last," he said. "She told me you would know which door it opened when the time came." Caleb held the key in his palm, feeling its worn edges, and for a moment he saw Eleanor on the porch in the storm, Thomas's photograph in her lap, Ranger sitting beneath the attic stairs, the roof crying out before anyone knew it was saving more than books. Martin looked toward the windows, his face unreadable. Claire wiped at one eye, quickly, as if she did not want the room to notice. Then, without ceremony, they left. Their car rolled down the long drive and disappeared into the pines. The house seemed quieter after that, but not empty. Caleb opened the west rooms before Christmas, just as Eleanor had written. He scrubbed floors, repaired window latches, painted walls the color of warm cream, and carried in donated beds from a church basement in Rockland. A retired Navy cook named Ben became the first resident, arriving with one duffel bag, a limp from an old knee injury, and a Labrador with grey around the muzzle. 2 days later came Mrs. Alvarez, 79, whose son had moved away and whose apartment heat had failed twice that winter. By New Year's Eve, 3 rooms held soft lamps, folded quilts, cleaned socks in dresser drawers, and the kind of silence that helps people sleep. Caleb did not hang a sign at first. He was afraid a name would make the miracle feel too large for him. But one morning he found Ranger sitting by the front gate, staring at the empty wooden board above it. In the shed, Caleb discovered Thomas's old carving tools and a plank of cedar saved from the original roof. By dusk, his hands had shaped the words Whitcomb Haven into the wood. Beneath them, in smaller letters, he carved a roof for those still finding home. That night, snow fell gently over the estate, covering the pastures, the repaired shingles, the long driveway where Caleb had once arrived as a stranger. Inside, Ben laughed softly in the kitchen while Mrs. Alvarez taught him how to season